great shepherd, the rock of all ages, Almighty God is He. Bow down before Him, love and adore Him. His name is wonderful, Jesus my Lord. Be seated. We turn today to my favorite letter that Paul wrote. I've always, ever since around the year 2000, kind of been partial to the book of Philippians. When I was at Averett in college, one of my courses was to take the second missionary journey of Paul. So I've been to Ephesus and Corinth and Thessalonica, although they call it Thessaloniki. But of all the places, Philippi was my favorite. And there was an incident at Philippi that just captured my attention. And ever since then, when someone mentions the book of Philippians, my mind goes back to that day. We were standing there at Philippi looking at the jail that Paul had been in. Remember the story? He and Silas were in the jail and the earthquake happens and the Philippian jailer says, "What must I do to be saved?" and all that stuff. So we're standing there looking at that jail, and it wasn't much of a jail. And on the back end of the city was a huge hill. And as the tour guide was talking, we heard this, what sounded like a cowbell. And we looked up on the side of the hill, and there was a shepherd. And the shepherd was leading his sheep, and with the sheep were goats. And I've always, read the story, I will separate the goats from the sheep. And I thought, okay, that's no big deal. Who can't tell the difference between a goat and a sheep? But that day when you see this, and he was a young man, probably 13 or 14, leading his sheep and his goats, when you looked up, you know what? You couldn't tell the difference between the sheep and the goats. They looked so much alike. Ever since that day, that passage where Jesus separates the sheep from the goats really has come alive. And every time I mention the book of Philippians, that's where my mind goes. So we turn to Philippians chapter 1 today, reading verses 3 through 8. I thank my God every time I remember you, constantly praying with joy in every one of my prayers for all of you, because of your sharing in the gospel from the first day until now. I love this verse. I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work among you will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. It is right for me to think this way about all of you because you hold me in your heart. For all of you sharing God's grace with me, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. For God is my witness, how I long for all of you with the compassion of Christ Jesus. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, I must be getting old because I have done something this week that I never thought I would do. In fact, I had kind of chided some people that this had happened to. I've always been told, don't say what you won't do. So I'm standing outside talking to my mother on the telephone. And I was it was a nice day, and I was looking around, and I looked at my car, and there it was. My inspection sticker said 10/20. 10:20. 10:20, October. It's November. I have never done that before. I've always said, now what kind of a dummy can't every time they get in their car see when their inspection sticker is due and go have it inspected at the right time? Uh-oh, I see some. So I said, well, what? I said, I'm getting ready to go to the beach. What am I going to do? So I called the Marathon on Riverside. I told them what happened. They said, come on down. We'll take care of it, no problem. So on the way down, wasn't, 3 or 4 miles, I said out loud, I was the only one in the car. I guess that means I'm getting old too. But I said out loud to no one but me, I said, if Wallace or Lewis were still alive, this would not have happened. Because those 2 men tried their best to take care of me. I can't tell you how many times I would look out and Wallace would be looking at my stickers. Lewis would be going by and he would be running his... I've seen Lewis out there with a penny making sure my tires were okay. And as I went to get my car inspected, I smiled. And I thank God that he sent those 2 men into my life. And I said, God, I was so blessed to get to know and to have those 2 men taking care of me. Then my mind went to our text, because that's really what Paul is doing. I love this passage because it almost seems out of character for Paul. But Paul begins this book, this letter, I thank my God every time I think about you. Isn't that wonderful? And Paul goes on to write what I think is the most joyful letter he ever wrote, the sweetest letter he ever wrote, maybe even the most personal letter he ever wrote to these folks in Philippi. Well, who were they? What had they done to make such an impact on Paul's life? Well, Paul hadn't been there in 10 years. The book of Philippians was written about 10 years after Paul had been in Philippi. And Paul didn't get to stay in Philippi long, because there was this incident where, shortly after he got there, he had to leave after being arrested, beaten, and jailed, because some of the local citizens were mad because Paul had healed a young slave girl. Evidently, she was emotionally disturbed, and she was being used by her owners as kind of a fortune teller. So Paul heals her, and she can't do that anymore. Well, they had just lost money, so they had Paul arrested. So Paul didn't get to stay there long. But even after leaving, even 10 years after that incident, Paul thinks about the church, about Lydia and her leadership, about her family, about his friends in Philippi. He thinks about how supportive they were of him, how loyal they were. For 10 years, they had kept in touch with Paul. They had been sending him messages. They had been sending him encouragement. They had even been sending him money. Their generosity, their kindness overwhelmed him. And he never forgot it. He considered them the closest friends he had in ministry. The bond that he had with these folks was immeasurable and unbreakable. So in around 62 AD, from a Roman jail, Paul writes to these people, I thank my God every time I remember you. I thank God. I think every time Paul thought of the Philippians, a smile came over his face. What can we learn from this passage? What can we in 2020 take away from a text that was written in 62? Well, I think there are two things. Two things that we can take away this Thanksgiving week. The first thing is this. Some of the best days to count your blessings are during the toughest times of our lives. As I mentioned, Paul did not pen these words sitting on a beach overlooking the beautiful Mediterranean Sea. No, these words were written from a Roman jail. He was a prisoner. And this was just one of the many trials that Paul would face during his ministry. He was no stranger to hunger. He was no stranger to pain. He was no stranger to loneliness. He almost died in a shipwreck. On more than one occasion, Paul was beaten. He was left to die, and he knew what it was like to be blamed and punished unjustly. He knew what it was like to be forsaken by those that he thought would always stand by him. And as he's sitting in this jail cell, I think the one thing he was looking for was peace of mind and peace of heart. Later in the book of Philippians, Paul would tell people exactly how they could experience peace of mind and peace of heart. Later in this same book, in chapter 4, listen to what Paul says. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence and anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And when you do that, the God of peace will be with you. So as Paul is chained to a Roman soldier, at least one, as he knows that he might be executed this time, as he knows he is not getting to do what he wants to do, he searches for peace. And his mind goes back to these people in Philippi. And even in the midst of his struggles, even in the midst of his trial, I think a smile came on his face. Because you see, Paul learned a lesson. Paul learned that just because you're in prison does not mean you have to be imprisoned. Just because you are in chains does not mean you have to be enchained spiritually and emotionally. How good are you at counting your blessings when things aren't going like you had planned? I suspect most of us struggle with that. And too often, when things don't go the way we planned, instead of thinking about something that will give us peace and make a smile come across our face, we become angry and bitter and cynical and envious and even vindictive. That's why it's so important to follow Paul's example. Counting our blessings will lift our spirits. It will bring the best out in us, and it will reveal where God is working on our behalf. And it will remind us that we are not alone on our journey of faith. Somebody wrote this. He said, I don't think I have ever experienced a situation in my life which was completely devoid of anything good, because the light of the world, who is always at our side, will never let it get that dark. Think about that. I'm told that about a month after the stock market crashed in 1929, things were getting rough. Things were getting bad. And outside of Boston, the local ministers gathered to plan their annual Thanksgiving service. The stock market had just crashed. The nation was in shambles. How could they plan a Thanksgiving service? Food lines were already starting. People were going hungry. People did not know what to do next. Some of the ministers said, well, we need to cancel it this year. There's no way we can plan a Thanksgiving service in a climate like this. Some of the other ministers said, well, if we do have it, let's kind of skip over the theme of being thankful and let's look to some other thing. Then one minister spoke up, Dr. William Stigger, and he offered an alternative view. He reminded his fellow ministers that the Pilgrims celebrated the first Thanksgiving in the midst of great hardship. They had devastating losses. And then he said this. He said, this was because they were most thankful for someone and not something. Let me say that again. I want it to sink in. Even in the midst of horrible, devastating loss and hardships, they celebrated Thanksgiving because they were thankful for someone and not something. And that someone was the God who was always by their side, guiding them and empowering them. Who are you thankful for this Thanksgiving? I think this passage tells us another thing that we ought to take to heart. And that's this. We should be the kind of a person who brings a smile to people's faces when they think about us. Let me ask you, when people think of you, do they smile? Or do they go, well, do they roll their eyes? What do people do when they think of you? You know, there are people that have been in my life that when I think of them, even to this day, I smile. Many of you may remember Opal Glidewell. When I first moved to Danville, every time I saw Opal's number come up on my phone, I smiled. Because I knew she was calling to say, if you get a moment, stop by, because I baked you something. To this day, when I think of Opal, I smile. Many of you may remember Helen Clark. Helen Clark, when I first came to Danville, said to me, I knew you'd be a great preacher because my grandson's named Adam. And every Sunday going out the door, she would take my hand and she would say, it's always a blessing to be in God's house. And I thank God every day for sending you to us. Every time I think of her, I smile. Every time I think of those two ladies, and I could go on, but every time I think of them, I thank God for bringing those kind of people into my life. Paul, when he thought about the Philippians, he said, I thank my God for you. Every time I think of you, it's with joy. I think that means he smiled. Are you the type of a person that when people think about you, they have a smile on their face? That when your name comes across their mind or their heart, when they hear someone talk about you, do they smile because you have made such an impact on their life? Folks, we're living in dark times. We're living in a day where people are hurting, where people feel alone. People need something and someone to bring joy to their life. Will you be one of those people? Will you be the type of a person that people can say, when I think about you, I thank my God. When I think about you, I smile. because of the difference you have made in my life. You say, well, what can I do? There's something you can do. Obviously, somebody needs to start looking at my cars and my tires. There are other things. You could write a note to someone. You could give a call to someone. You could go up to someone and you could just say, I appreciate everything you've done for me. What can you do to make someone smile this Thanksgiving? I read a story. Her name was Mary Tippett. She became a widow in 1963. She was 35 years old. She never remarried. She lived in Dallas, Texas. Her husband was a policeman on the Dallas police force. You may remember what happened in November of 1963 in Dallas. President John F. Kennedy was shot. Well, Lee Harvey Oswald also killed that day Officer J.D. Tippett. President Kennedy and Officer Tippett were buried on the same day. But because Kennedy was the president, nobody thought about Officer Tippett. 8 days, though. 8 days after John F. Kennedy's death, Mary Tippett got a letter in the mail. A handwritten letter from Jackie Kennedy. Miss Kennedy wrote, "What can I say to you? My husband's death is responsible for you losing your husband. Wasn't one life enough to take on that day?" And what Miss Kennedy wrote next inspired and encouraged Miss Tippett more than words could ever express. She said, "I lit a flame for Jack at Arlington that will burn forever. I consider that it burns for your husband too. And so will everyone who ever sees it." Years and years and years later, Mary Tippett still has that letter. Miss Kennedy was going through a lot, as you know. But she chose. Let me say that again. She chose. It was a choice. She chose to be the type of a person that would bring a smile to somebody else's face. Who needs your support at this time in their life? What would a word of encouragement or a letter of support mean to them? How would a compliment or a financial gift lift their spirits? What difference would a phone call or a visit make in their lives? You see, the same thing that endeared the Philippians to Paul will endear us to those we know. What was it? It was compassion. It was humility. It was loyalty. It was encouragement. And folks, those things don't cost a cent. Those things are something everyone can give. This Thanksgiving week, will you take some time to examine your heart? To examine your priorities? Will you ask the Lord to show you what you can do better? Will you ask God to help you bring a smile on someone else's face? Will you pray the prayer that goes, God, help me to be the type of person that when people think about me, they thank God? Will you do that? It'll change the world. But you know what else? It'll change you. That's what we need more than anything this Thanksgiving.